Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are right now. Thank you for joining us for this session on the war in Ukraine and assessment. Here we will be two presenters. I'm Karina Korostelina. I'm professor at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm also director of the Peace Lab on Reconciling Conflict and Intergroup Division. And my co-presenter and my colleague who we work together on the project, and Gerard Toal. Gerard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here. I am Gerard Toal. I am a professor in the School of Public International Affairs at Virginia Tech in the Washington, D.C. area, headquartered in Boston.
So what we will be presenting today is results of our project which we received from National Science Foundation. And it will be, I think, a little bit, we can say several words about the project, which before we start the presentation, we were very thankful for National Science Foundation to give us opportunity to conduct research. While we started in February, we already getting funding in the end of the spring, so which was very generous and very important, and we will had the opportunity to conduct research, and we will be talking to you about our survey and our interviews. Gerard, do you want to add maybe some introductory remarks?
So yeah, this is ongoing research, and it is one where we have two data points for the data we're going to present, but the research is actually multi-pronged research. It's both survey research as well as in-person interviews, as well as we're going to be analyzing policymakers and what policymakers are saying, and the particular discourse which is all around us on this important issue.
Okay, so I will start sharing the PowerPoint, and at some moment we will see if we also can opportunity also Gerard can share several slides. So let's just a second, share screen. Okay, can you see it now? Okay, wonderful. So again, this is research on wartime attitudes and identity in frontline Ukrainian cities, which we conducted during a year and a half, almost, during this research. The guiding questions for this particular project were: how do frontline Ukrainians exposed to physical violence and material victims of it think about how the war ends, ceasefire, negotiation, cost of peace? How do understand the identity relative to Russia and its leaders? How frontline Ukrainians think about territory of Ukraine and various regions? And what are differences in how frontline Ukrainians reason about wartime dilemmas and trade-offs? So basically here we analyze wartime experiences and attitudes, social boundaries and multi-dimensionality of threat. We also speak about sacred values and territorial invisibility, and about war experiences and attitude toward peace. Our survey sites were, as we already told, in eastern Ukraine, and mostly in three cities: Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and Poltava, because this is the cities where they have majority of IDPs coming, but also cities which were constantly under attack of bombing and rockets by Russia. Why you see other here, it's because then we said have a second round of interviews in April 2023, some people moved. So because we did a panel, we tried to reach the same participants that we came with some, especially for IDPs, you see a higher number of people who move into different regions. So we conducted 2 rounds, one round in July 2022 and the second round in April 2023. This is sample characteristics. It's a huge table. If you will be interested, we can return to it. But basically what we want to stress here is that it was pretty good representation of gender. Of course, there were more women because men were at the front lines at this time and continues to be there. We have pretty good representation of age. And one very important point, which I want to stress, that when we speak about native language, people show that 60% of them show that it's Ukrainian and 36% show that it's Russian. So we'll start with a discussion on identity and social boundaries. When we ask people what their major ideas of Ukraine, and in other research, in our own research, we saw that everyone, 99%, showing that they identify with Ukrainian nation, they have strong Ukrainian national identity. But what does it mean? What Ukrainian national identity entails? And what we see in majority of publication, especially in media, that everyone is discussing Ukrainians have united idea of Ukrainian identity. We were actually wanted to explore what does it mean. And we asked them 3 questions related to 3 different concepts of national identity: ethnic, multicultural, and civic, where ethnic identity represents prevalence of one ethnic group, multicultural ability of multiple groups to exercise their identity freedom, and the third group, it's civic, meaning identity, where ethnicity or language or religion do not matter, and what is important is contract between people and a state. And as you see from the slides, I will do slideshow, which will be better. As you see from this particular slide, then people see they identify with Ukraine as homeland of ethnic Ukrainians was the smallest group. And the highest group was the people who identify as citizens of Ukraine first and foremost. When we also ask people, what does it mean in 2023, we ask people, what does it mean to be a good citizen of Ukraine? And we ask, does it mean to speak Ukrainian language? Does it mean to reject Soviet history? Does it mean to respect different cultures? And does it mean loyalty to Ukrainian independent of ethnicity, language, and culture? Basically, we represented this concept, adding this anti-Soviet concept. And as you see, majority of people strongly agree with the highest percentage was agreement that being a good citizen of Ukraine means loyalty to Ukraine independent of ethnicity, language, and culture. So majority of frontline Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine see national identity as civic, not ethnic. When we ask, this is a presentation for ethnic, as you see, there are pretty high distribution, especially among IDPs, those who run from occupied territories under Russia, they still strongly reject the just one ethnic conceptual idea. This table represents for you also in a different way how people see meaning of Ukrainian national identity. And here you clearly see in comparison that civic meaning of national identity prevails over all other ideas. We also explore dynamics of European and Russian cultural identity. And what we found, not surprisingly, that European identity become more and more important, its salience increased. What was interesting for us to find that Russian cultural identity still persist among some group of population, while very small percentage strongly agree. There are pretty high percentage of people, around 10% or even more, who agree that they still have a Russian cultural identity. And this is very important for us to understand that the cultural identity is different from the loyalty to Russia and Russia state. People clearly distinguish between being Russian as a loyal to Russia or connected to Russia, or be connected to the Russian cultural space, linguistic space. And what we really were very very interesting results, that one of the strongest social boundaries which we found between Ukrainians and Russians was the voice, the moral boundary. Majority of Ukrainian people agree that the Ukrainians are better people than Russians. That and you see this strength of moral boundary through the war. Now we can compare this 10 months in the war. We can see that moral boundary become even stronger between people. And we also see that perception of Russia as a threat also very important, and people see the perception that Russia position threat to economic, financial welfare of their lives. And if we compare changes from 2022 and 2023, we also see that perception of threat actually was stronger, a little bit stronger in 2022 than 2023, which posit a lot of very interesting dynamics about really seeing Ukrainian people as brave and better people than Russian people. So they see Russian people less threatened. This brings us to the idea of emotions. We ask people to mark their emotions for feeling of hatred, and 79% marked 10 for anger. And this is what we see. This is the slight decline from the results from July 22. Then 82% indicated that they have a hatred and 83% of anger. However, what we see that fear increased. And this is very interesting, again, dynamic of emotions, where people start seeing more fear because of continuous bombing, continuous attack on civilians, specifically targeting civilian population by Russian groups. So this is example. Then we ask about again hate in 23 and 24. So you will see that hate was pretty high, but the difference is then we ask hate toward Russian leadership and hate toward Russian citizens, you see pretty significant difference. And this gives us idea that Ukrainian people differentiate between seeing Russian leadership as responsible for violence, for war, while people still feeling hate, pretty high hate toward Russian citizens, distribution of hate is slower. The same if we speak about anger, you see very similar tendency. If we speak about fear, you see very similar tendency. Again, what we found that Ukrainian people differentiate between leadership and citizens, which somehow opens opportunity for reconciliation, not right now, of course, maybe 20, 30 years ahead of the road, the same as happened with Germany and France, but it's showing us clear differentiation. Finally, we ask people how they feel pride, and it's another emotion. And we found that Ukrainian people are very proud in Ukrainian military, but less proud in Ukrainian leadership. And they also very proud of Ukrainian citizens. And again, we asked it in July 2023, and we, in our interpretation of it, that there were several scandals in Ukraine regarding corruptions and so on during the war, and this can be influencing how people see Ukrainian leadership. Meaning of the war. This was very important for us to understand how people see the war, and we ask people when they think about the loss of people I love and know. I believe it's critical to continue war or start negotiation. And what you clearly see that then we prime people and try to ask them to think about the losses, about people as their neighbors and family members and so on. They more inclined to continue war until Ukraine wins and start negotiation to immediate ceasefire. They also believe that the war is very just, because this is a belief in just war. They believe that it's extremely important because Ukraine is fighting for its freedom, and that's for all Europe. And this would give people this emotional support and give them motivation to continue being engaging in war. But it's also showing that for people, the conceptual idea of a just war, which is very strongly represented in the literature and usually connected with support for continuous war or continuous engagement and conflict, we see here also in our results. And when we ask people, are you pessimistic or optimistic or pessimistic about Ukrainian victory, we see people are pretty optimistic, but still there are some distribution. But then we ask people, I'm confident Ukraine will win because justice is on your side. Then we see much stronger support and agreement with that. It means that belief in just war, belief that people fighting for the just cause, really strongly increase the motivation of people. So then I will turn to Gerard. Gerard, do you want to share your PowerPoint or?
No, it's okay. So why don't we just keep the PowerPoint that you had there, and I'll just work with it. So good morning, everyone. So my particular interest was in exploring the attitudes towards territory and the ways in which territory is part of potential peace negotiations or part of the costs of peace. Now, in dealing with the whole question of territory, we are, of course, dealing with multiple stakeholders who have attitudes and dispositions towards territory. The territorial integrity, the norm of uti possidetis juris, is well established in the international community, and it is one that has anchored international law in the Cold War period and post Cold War period. It is, of course, a controversial notion in as much as the alternative principle of self-determination is one that's often articulated by organized groups who find a self-determination unit, let's say Kosovo, and then declare independence against this particular principle, and then the international community has to deal with that. So we are dealing with a very powerful norm in the international community. We're also dealing with major powers who have a history of dealing with that norm and supporting it until such time as they don't support it, or creating exceptions by, for example, declaring Kosovo sui generis and therefore justifiable as something that can be recognized as a separate state from Serbia. So you have that particular feature. We were also interested in the ways in which, beyond simply it being a matter of territorial integrity, international law, which ties into the belief in, as Karina mentioned, in a just belief in a just world. So your attitude towards territory may be shaped by the fact that the international community is affirming what it is that you believe. But you also have the idea of territorial indivisibility, which is something that is more associated with the development of a national identity, is socialized into that identity, and people will have emotional attachments to certain territory. They may have holidayed in that particular territory, they may not live there, but they're attached to a particular, even like a map logo, a certain visualization of the state. And so if that visualization is compromised in a certain way, that is seen as an affront to the particular identity. There's a third aspect to this too, and that is that territory is a sacred identity. It is something that is beyond a negotiation. It is part of a group identity. It is our home, our homeland, and therefore is seen as extremely important. So what we hypothesized at the beginning of this is that the prospects of a land for peace discussion and negotiations would be unacceptable for three reasons: because territorial integrity is a well-established norm, because of the establishment in the post-independence generation in Ukraine of this idea of territorial indivisibility, and then because of territory as a sacred value. So let's go to the next slide. So we asked folks in these surveys, can you tell us 4 things that you believe are sacred in your life today in Ukraine? As expected, family and lives comes first. But you can see that quite close to these. So of the 4, you will have folks generally saying family and lives and protecting our family as number 1, but land and territory come quite quickly behind. So defending our land from invasion, the independence of Ukraine, Ukraine's territorial integrity, all of those, the territorial integrity discourse may be associated with just world. It's more legal. Independence of Ukraine is very much part of socialized identity. Defending the land from invasion, that gets at sacred values. So we see this particular clash that there are sacred values, but there's going to be a clash between family and land and territory. Okay, so we go to the next slide. So then we tested these particular principles by giving people a prompt and asking whether they agreed or disagreed with it. So an undivided national territory is an essential value of the Ukrainian nation. Overwhelmingly strong agreement with that. And we can see the contrast between the survey we did in 2022, in July of 2022, and then this smaller survey, follow-up survey, which was a CATA survey, a computer-aided telephone survey of just 500 in April of 2023. We asked all of Ukraine's national territory is sacred to me, and you can see it's more or less similar. Okay, we go to the next. Then we asked people to kind of react to a prompt, and when you're reacting to a prompt, you're sort of you're cueing a certain attitude, and therefore it takes more sort of mental effort to disagree with that attitude. So what we were cueing here was this sense that life and well-being comes before questions of territory and geopolitics. And as you can see, there's actually quite a bit of disagreement. So what we're getting at, that question gets right at the heart of this tension between the sacred value of life and looking after one's own life and family, and these larger questions concerning territory and geopolitics. And so, you see this opinion all over the place. One of the things I would note here is the bottom one, which is the 2023 results, is if you pay attention, there's increasingly less strongly agree. There's more strongly disagree. It's small, but there's some movement there. Now, we're not comparing exactly apples and apples here. You could say it's apples and oranges, but it's at least worth noting that. Okay. Then we wanted to get at the question of sacrifice. And this in particular is really, really key at understanding the degree to which there's meaning making going on here. So we said, we prompted here in a different way because of the sacrifice of the Ukrainian soldiers during this war. It is more important than ever that Ukraine never concede any territory to Russia. So essentially what you're doing is saying there has to be, to recognize and to honor the dead, and to honor sacrifice. So it's very much a sort of sacred value discourse. To honor that, we have to not concede any territory, and we could even go further and say we have to reclaim that territory. But we're saying never concede. And of course, in a peace negotiations, we don't expect Ukraine would ever concede, but the de facto actual peace negotiation may be one where Ukraine doesn't have full control over its territory, like it has not had full control over its territory since 2014 as a consequence of the annexation of Crimea and the subversion of the Donbass and the sponsoring of Russian proxy actors in the Donbass. So therefore, you can see strong sentiment in this. So you can get some sense of the relationship of sacrifice to territory. So the next one. Then we, in effect, asked this question in a different way. And so we asked it, again, front-loading a particular attitude. It is imperative to seek a ceasefire to stop Russians from killing Ukraine's young men as the future of the nation. And as you can see, there is, by and large, agreement with this particular attitude. Now, this doesn't mean that Ukraine is necessarily conceding territory, but but it is about the ceasefire. It is about stopping the war. And of course, that's an extremely controversial position in Ukraine right now. But by and large, what we have seen between 2022 and 2023 is greater support for the idea of seeking a ceasefire. And, you know, with all of the caveats that I mentioned earlier in terms of these two surveys. So the next slide. So then we asked this sort of wartime dilemma, getting at the heart of this key conflict within sacred values. What's more important, to save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, or to continue the war to free all Ukrainian territories, including Crimea and the Donbass? As you can see here, this is a sort of major conflict for the Ukrainian people. It is one that generates a diversity of opinions. It is a painful dilemma to sort out. And as you can see, saving lives, very important, both equally. Freeing territory, very important. What we see in the movement between the two surveys, as you can see there, is there's a little more movement towards the middle. But you know, that's what the survey affirms more than anything else, is that this is crucially divisive, difficult issue in Ukraine right now. So then in terms of geopolitics and the ceasefire and attitudes towards that, so we have asked, we asked a question which gets at another interest that I have had with colleagues down the years, which is the degree to which there's sort of conspiracist cognition going on. And by and large, what we found down the years is that 50, sometimes 50% of the population are attracted to conspiratorial narratives. And in this particular case, we use this question here, which is: great powers always use Ukraine in their political games. And so this is a question which is good because it gets you at the sense that people feel that they are sort of being manipulated, and that they're part of a larger game. As you can see, there's quite a bit of agreement on this, more agreement than disagreement with it. So there is this strong local suspicion of the larger geopolitical context and the games that are being played. And that, I think, could be quite important going forward. Maybe a little more movement away from that sentiment in the second survey. And then we asked a question whether Western powers are providing aid to Ukraine only because Ukraine is fighting a war for them against Russia. So sort of leaning into this conspiratorial narrative. And as you can see, there is a strong agreement amongst some Ukrainians towards this. And those that are strongly disagree with that are a minority relative to others. So I think that's worth paying attention to. Okay. Then we asked, this is from 2023, whether people are happy with the level of international aid and military support provided to Ukraine. As you can see, there is strong support for that, mostly happy about that. Okay. Then how much do you support negotiations with Russia on a complete ceasefire? And this is probably one of the more interesting survey experiments that we did in the two surveys, where we had a question with three, essentially, one question and then two other treatments of that. So the question was, how much do you support? That's a sort of general question, which we asked a third of the survey respondents. Then we exposed a third to a treatment, which is we added that President Zelensky supports negotiations. How much do you support negotiations? And then we asked a second treatment, which is EU and US leaders support. How much do you support? What you will see is that total support in 2022 for negotiations and slight support, that is the majority sentiment. Of course, if you put neutral with don't, slightly against, and totally against, that becomes majority sentiment. But there's quite a division about this. You can see how Zelensky moves the needle in terms of support for negotiations. So if Zelensky is to come out and endorse negotiations, that moves sentiment significantly towards negotiations. But sentiment is already there amongst the Ukrainian people. And then, as you can see with the EU leaders, one of the things that we found in the 2022 survey is that there was actually a bit of a backlash against endorsement by EU and US leaders, where more people were against negotiations after it was endorsed by US and EU leaders. The effect is not, overwhelming, but it is noticeable. That goes away in the second iteration of this. As you can see, however, there's sentiment towards sentiment against negotiating with Russia has strengthened in 2023. And so therefore endorsement by Zelensky has less of an effect now than it did have in the past. Endorsement by the EU and EU leaders is similar to the effect that Zelensky had. But that indicates hardening of attitude towards negotiations, and it indicates a very polarized and deeply divided polity on this particular question. Okay.
So, and the last, what we want to discuss, we conducted also 90 interviews. The interviews were collected to us by the Kharkiv University. And it's very preliminary results, but we just want to show you some ideas what we are getting from these results. We ask a lot of questions, so it will be very interesting results coming. But first question was regarding language and identity, the same question which you saw we explore during the survey. And when we ask people how they see issue related to language and identity, that majority of people strongly agree that Ukrainian language should be promoted, it should be part of curricula, it should be part of everyday life. But they also stress that their Russian language is a cultural language, and they feel some pressure to speak Ukrainian and Ukrainization. They also believe that language creates some conflict dynamics in Ukraine. There's East-West conflict, and there are even some people who are speaking about a strong movement against Russian language and hate towards Russian language in Ukraine. We ask people how they see ending of the war. And again, this is the themes which come from interviews, very preliminary. So what we see that people see that war can be ended first based on Russia-related factors. It could be Russia then will withdraw, or was that Russia could be disintegrated, or more sanctions on Russia will impact. But it's not how they see the real, the main factors ending the war. The main factors related to the victory, and victory considered the main source of ending the war. They strongly believe that support for Ukraine of international community should continue, and it's very important idea. And the victory itself is the key for finishing the violence in Ukraine. When we discuss with them which particular territories they believe should be returned to Ukraine, majority of people prefer 1991 territory rather than territory of 2022 after the invasion of in 2014 to Crimea and to Donetsk area. But some also people talk about negotiation, and that idea that a ceasefire is very important, the key for negotiation, but also they stress importance of having a multilateral Ukraine, having including third party, and also the key here that Ukraine should be positioned in the center of negotiation. It should not be negotiated for Ukraine. It's very interesting that I was in Ukraine just before the war in December 2021. It was a joke about it going in Ukraine. Then people were telling there are negotiations with Russia, but Ukraine is not at the table. Ukraine is on the table. And this feeling, what Gerard was talking about, the geopolitical game, still very strong, and people believe that they have to be strongly insistent on Ukraine as a central position on these ideas. And of course, then what requirements, then people mostly are interested about repatriation and security for Ukraine. And finally, very important topic, which we will be discussing in our next presentation, which is growing right now very seriously. It's the idea of integration of occupied territories. And when people discuss this particular issue, they're talking about policies, of course, that it should be economic development, it should be winning hearts and minds of people, give people a choice and giving them autonomy. But the key here is real idea of a difficult process. And many of our interviews, people who we interviewed, many of them were actually under occupied territory, and then they were freed or they were able to escape. And they speaking about this awful pressure, violence by Russian authorities, complete inability to express opinions or resist. And at the same time, they're telling it's a very difficult process of reintegration, and it should be done with care and understanding who cooperated, who did not, who were happy to see it and who were just silenced. And some people could not leave because of their health. Some people could not leave because of they had to take care about their elderly parents or family members and so on. So they really show more complexity about integration, and they stress that people on occupied territories share common identity with Ukraine, but justice should be brought, and they do discuss collaborators who were there actively cooperating with Russian authorities. So this issue will come up. We see it as a major issue for Ukraine going forward, with more and more territories we hope will be open for retake and connected back to Ukraine. But this will be our forthcoming attraction, and we will be talking about it during the spring breaks, and we will analyze all results. So I will stop here, and we open the we have 30 minutes for questions and answers or comments. Please raise your hand. While you're thinking, what I want to stress is very similar issue which we both of us discover, and that this idea of how exposure to violence lead to peace. And we didn't present here this particular results, but we are now in course of publication paper. It's was revised and in course of publication, where we actually explore how attitude, how exposure to violence lead towards the support for peace, because this issue is not widely explored in the literature, and even if explored, it gives completely opposite conclusion. Some literature showing that more people exposed to violence, the more they support peace. Other literature show not, the more they support war. What we were able to actually to do, instead of just measuring by one particular measurement exposure to violence, we measure different types. The exposure being IDPs, lose property, lose a close friend or neighbor, or losing a family member. And we found that actually they act completely differently. We found that people who were IDPs and who lost the property, they are inclined more support peace process, while people who lose a friend or especially family member, they're inclined to support the war. And this is the very interesting results which support what we found in our other surveys. Then people who lost friends, they want to continue war rather than looking for peace. I see the question in chat. Lisa, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I can unmute myself. I was just wondering if there was an explanation for I remember that you were saying in the first round, there was a lot of showed sentiment with Zelensky's position to negotiate, and there was less alignment with the EU and the US positions. But in the second round, there was increased sentiment with the EU and US, if I understand that correctly. And I was just wondering if you had some sort of explanation for that, or had a thought of why that would happen. Like, is it because of the increased aid and attention that's been given, or is it just something that developed naturally? I'm not sure.
So I think that this is a large question, and so what we're picking up in this survey is something that has to be affirmed by other surveys before we can make any conclusion that this is indeed a phenomena that we have seen, and it is indeed something that is Ukrainian-wide. What that nevertheless, our own results nevertheless are sufficient to allow us to speculate, and I think it's fairly clear that initially there were strong reservations on the part of major powers, on the part of European powers, about providing aid to Ukraine, the nature of that, restricting certain types of aid, fighter jets, tanks, long-range artillery, and the like. And that gradually over the course of the war, that those sets of restrictions have been dropped. And so you have an increasing sort of creeping intensified militarization of the war, increasing, that's one framing. Another framing is there's increasingly more fulsome support for Ukraine and Ukraine's fight, especially when it has been sort of affirmed, or it has been established, still tacit, but nevertheless real, that the prospect of Russia using nuclear weapons has diminished. And so therefore that this is a war that has certain upper limits. And those upper limits are anything that doesn't involve nuclear weapons. Fighter jets and all of Leopard tanks and all of those things are pretty heavy equipment. Obviously, those are their presence in Ukraine is part of the fight right now, and so it is understandable that there would be sentiment change on the part of Ukrainians as they see those heavy weapons now in action, and they're affirmed in the media. It's a wartime situation, and so you have the celebration of particular achievements by the Ukrainian military in media at the moment, and those are associated with weapons that are provided by the West, as well as the weapons that the Ukrainians are increasingly making themselves. So it's understandable that is likely an explanation for that. I mean, what we're dealing with here is an intractable war, and there's so much going on that and it's changing so much that we would really need to be doing surveying every month to get a good tracking on public opinion. I'm sure the US government is probably doing that. It's just we are small researchers and don't have that capacity.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments? Please just raise your hand so we can see it. And yes, Wahab, please. Can you unmute yourself? I did ask to unmute. Yeah, you should be able to unmute.
Okay, now I think I can.
Oh, good.
Okay, so thank you very much for this nice presentation. I had a couple of questions. One was this individual identity. I heard saying that it's family and lives of identity is strongest, in addition to territorial integrity. My question is, how has this war affected the individual identity being a Ukrainian? Has that boosted that identity or make it more salient, or did not change, or what is the status? And in addition, what is the role of identity in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Thank you.
So we presented in the beginning that not only based on our research, but also based on many other surveys which we see our colleagues conducting. By the way, today we just got good news that our panel, which we will be doing at ISA, is accepted, and it will be a set of scholars, each of who conducted recently research in Ukraine. So it will be a very interesting panel where me and Gerard will be presenting our research and our colleagues' other research. So if you're going to ISA, it will be, please join us there. But the other research also shows that there is a strong increase in Ukrainian national identity. And unfortunately, we also see interpretation of it as everyone feels the same homogenization process. And this is very usual for any conflict dynamics of war, when a society under pressure, under invasion during the war, usually very homogenized and other voices are silenced, and it becomes normative to share the same similar opinions. That's why we decided to dig deeper and see is that there are three different types of forms of social identity, ethnic national identity, multicultural and civic have prevail. And we clearly found from both surveys in 2022 and also in 2023 that multicultural and civic, especially civic, prevails among the people. And the same we find in interviews. Also, we didn't show here, we have so much results, that while a social boundary between nations extremely silent, then a social boundary as a symbolic boundary is still less important, because people still see how some cultural characteristics. And what we saw from interviews, Eastern Ukrainians telling that we consider Russian culture as a culture of Pushkin, of ballet, of something else. And for us, it's not what is related to current culture. And they really very strongly against current culture in Russian Federation. Moreover, majority of our people in our interviews shows that they stop listening to Russian media, period. They stop participating in Russian discussion where they know that it's led by Russian propaganda or misinformation. So they clearly understand what's going on, and answering your question regarding identity, role of identity in this conflict, it's extremely important, because Russia completely denies separate identity for the Russian Federation. Oh, sorry, for Russian Federation completely denies separate identity between Russian Federation and Ukraine. And this is the very important part of justification of the war. But also what we see is that Russia, in other justifications, that they protect Russian-speaking population. But even results of our survey show that majority of people who are affected by war, we have data about how many of them lost property, how many of them lost friends, family member. Majority of these people are Russian-speaking population. So there are no interest, it's just the propaganda by Russia of defending on Russian-speaking population. But they able to speak about it because there are sentiments in Ukraine about creating Ukrainian ethnic identity instead of giving ability of multicultural ideas. And I was just at the conference in London where there were several sessions on Ukraine, and they were actually very representative of this dilemma, of this discussion there. Some Ukrainians advocated for multicultural and civic meaning, while some Ukrainians strongly suggesting that only Ukrainian language and Ukrainian ethnic group should prevail in Ukraine. Thank you. So, Jeff, can you, I see your question. If you're still here, can you unmute yourself? And welcome to York. I understand you are in York too.
Yes. Thank
Okay,
you, Karina.
welcome to York. Yes.
Yeah, I'm actually literally just arrived, and I'm unpacking and getting ready for the next session. So, but what prompted my question was I met a young woman who's ethnically Russian from the East, but identifies as Ukrainian. She's a student in Prague right now. And she was talking about how her peers, which are both young and educated, meaning most of her peers left Ukraine to go to Central and Western Europe to do their studies. She made the point that there's sort of she sees kind of a transition in which young people in particular see themselves both as Ukrainian, but also European. And then it's the European connectedness that she felt was particularly important in part because her family escaped, is now, they first went to Poland, they're now in the Czech Republic. And she said that sort of her narrative is similar to many that she has heard. So I just wondered whether some of what you've been able to glean from your surveys reflects any significance in either age differences or education differences.
I will start, and first of all, we actually did publish just like three pieces at the Canon Institute, exactly analyzing age difference. So I will be happy to, or maybe just if you have right here, maybe we can put it, and I can look while we will be answering. I have this.
Let me look.
Yeah. So, but what this was a lot, but what I specifically want to answer your question about Europeanness, because we actually discuss it a lot with Gerard, and this is what we see. Because I spoke to Ukrainian refugees and Gerald in Europe, and I found a strong difference on how they perceive what Europe is. Being European means completely different if refugees are in Poland, if they're in Czech Republic, or they're in Germany, and probably even more different than they're in Ireland. Because Polish national identity is extremely ethnic, extremely Catholic, and very homogeneous, while Prague have a little bit more difference within, and of course the German identity is extremely civic. And we have actually, this is a very interesting research question, which we hope we might be able to explore, that people who find being refugees in different, especially young people, who find to be refugees in different countries will have completely different meaning of Europeanness, and then they return back to Ukraine, they probably will be really have different conceptual idea how Ukraine should move forward. Do you want to add?
Let me just, I'm putting a series of links in the chat, and the last one addresses the generational issue. Here, I would just add two concepts that are in the literature that get at this dilemma. One is the Zelensky effect, which is the name of a book by Olga Onich and Henry Hale here at George Washington University. And it's a terrific book. And the central thesis is that Zelensky is a representative of a post-war generation. This is in certain ways a generational war. And what Putin is fighting is a particular cartoonish Soviet conception, a deeply ideological, deeply imperialistic of Ukraine, which is that Ukraine is essentially Russian, but it has been taken over by the classic Soviet communist enemy, which is the fascist. And so the particular rhetoric that he's using is the sort of storylines of the fascists that are coming to against the Soviet Union, and that was the ideology of the KGB. That was the ideology of the Cold War. There's no allowance for independent Ukraine since 1991, but Zelensky has grown up in that, and so that is a separate identity. It is European. It's increasingly European, but it's also its own thing. But it's certainly exposed to Europe in a way that Soviet Ukraine never was. And so that becomes a possibility for that generation. And so Zelensky articulates that. He's from the southeast. He is from a relatively small town there. He's Russian speaking, servant of the people, is largely in Russian, but he also speaks Ukrainian in that. There's an easy fluency in the language there. So he represents this idea of a civic Ukrainian identity. So that's the first concept, the idea of the Zelensky effect. The second concept is the idea that the civic identity of Ukraine is being filled with ethnic content. And that is potentially problematic in as much as, well, potentially problematic, potentially not. It's that if you're not a full Ukrainian citizen, if you don't speak Ukrainian, first and foremost, you have to have the correct history. And that correct history involves the demonization and the repudiation of the Soviet Union. Now, if you have had relatives, if you've grown up in the Soviet Union as part of the sort of propagandistic state, and you have a vision of the Soviet Union as having its moments of glory, whether it's in the Donbass in terms of achievements of industrial strength or whatnot, or the massive achievement of defeating Nazism, therefore repudiating the Soviet history, especially if you've got grandparents that fought and maybe died in the war, that's difficult for certain people. So there, the whole battle over history becomes really, really important. But the Ukrainian independence generation, it's that dialogue and that effort to try to have a much more balanced, non-propagandistic history, one that wasn't sort of part of a top-down mythologization of the great patriotic war. That's part of the effort to try to create the civic identity. But there's that alternative narrative from hardline nationalists in Western Ukraine who see the Soviet state as irredeemably evil, as a genocidal state because of the Holodomor and the like. And they even, they're quite conspiratorial, they even see Zelensky as a potential Russian agent. And those are the so-called 25% that didn't vote for Zelensky. When he was overwhelmingly elected, he won over the whole country except the Lviv. Not this, I think it's not the city, but there's a particular area that he did not win. He did not win a majority. That is part of Ukraine too. The particular identity, in one sense, their heroes, Bandera and the like, affirms the Putin narrative, so that Putin wants to see them all as fascists and the like. So that is something that Ukraine has to deal with as part of its process of forming its community and its identity. That is the sort of the ethnic content within the civic identity is a big struggle right now for Ukraine. Sorry, I talked a little bit too long there.
No, this. I think this is very important. I just want to add, again, it's a joke, but then I was doing research in Ukraine, and exactly as told, I also identify these 5 competing narratives, which is represented in the book. But one of the interesting observation was that Ukraine was built and was taught based on Marxist-Leninist ideas and using books of Marx and Engels and so on. But then Ukraine became independent in 1991 and started building capitalism and new European society. They use the same books of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, creating this capitalism of 19th century, creating the civic ethnic concept of like 19th century national conceptual ideas that nation build on ethnic term. And I always advocated for years that instead of creating duality of Russian imperialism, Russian ethnic group, and then Ukrainian ethnic group fighting with each other, instead Ukraine had to take the idea of liberal society and take the duality of totalitarian Russian regime versus liberal European Ukrainian regime. But this duality is still less important than in many heads of Ukrainians, Ukraine versus Russia. And this is what we hope our work also will help to change. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. If any questions, any other maybe comments? So Jill, do you want to like do some concluding remarks, and we will?
I think that I would just underscore the fact that Ukraine is a country that is under enormous pressure right now, and it is one that is worthy of support in its moment of trial. The stakes in this war are very high. It is a war that could potentially metastasize into something which is extremely dangerous beyond Ukraine. We hope that that doesn't happen. I note simply that it seems as if another war has broken out today in Karabakh, with Azerbaijan attacking Karabakh, an already weakened Karabakh. So there is a change in the international rules and the international order here, and this is a long war, but I do think that there is distinctions to be made between getting a ceasefire and getting negotiations does not necessarily mean conceding territory. And so I would hope that folks engage with this conflict in ways that are empathetic to the Ukrainian people and what they're suffering, but are also mindful of the really difficult dilemmas going forward, for whom there's no simple answer. I mean, there's enormous amount of mines now. It's the most mined place in Europe. Bosnia used to be that. Used to have that horrible distinction, and now Ukraine has that. And in fact, there's experts from Bosnia going to Ukraine for demining and the like. Dogs are being trained in Bosnia on demining, which are going to Ukraine. So we're mindful of those particular dilemmas. The dilemma that you mentioned, Karina, about reintegration, and the dilemma of the fact that, you know, the best option may be to simply a ceasefire, which would freeze the lines. You don't concede anything necessarily. I know a lot of people think that that's absolutely outrageous, but they seem to assume that time is on the side of the Putin regime, whereas I think it most definitely is not. So those are the concluding comments I would make.
Thank you very much. And again, we're really thankful to our National Science Foundation for giving us this opportunity to do this research. We wait and I will hope for more support for this research. We will continue it. And coming attraction again, please join us next Peace Week in the spring. Then we will be discussing about, it will be second week of March, when we will be discussing results of our interviews. Like those, I saw the question regarding the recordings. For everyone who registered for this session, you will receive email with recording from our event team who will do it for the Carter School. Again, thank you very much for joining us. And a lot of new sessions. It's an entire week full of great sessions. And please go to as much as more sessions as you can. Thank you.